The air was thick with tension as Samuel Harrington, a self-made millionaire known for his ruthless approach to business, made an offer that would change his life forever. A child, his child, would be born in a way no one could ever have imagined. Samuel had it all: wealth, power, and influence. Yet, there was one thing money could not buy: a legacy that would carry his name forward. It was an idea that had been swirling in Samuel's mind for years. In his arrogance, he believed his money could solve any problem. So, when he hired a young woman as his housekeeper, he saw an opportunity. The maid, Claire, was just another piece of the puzzle in his world, until he decided to take things further. "Carry my child," Samuel told her, his voice cold and transactional. "I'll pay you handsomely, of course. You'll want for nothing." Claire was stunned. She had never expected such a proposition. She was an ordinary woman with no grand dreams, yet here was a man offering her an extraordinary sum in exchange for what seemed like an impossible task. She was to bear his child, and in return, her life would be forever changed. It wasn't a romantic proposal. It wasn't driven by love or desire, it was simply business. Samuel viewed it that way, and for a while, Claire agreed. After all, it was an offer no one could refuse. But what neither of them anticipated was how the child would change everything. As the months passed, Claire's growing belly became a symbol of the strange pact they had made. But Samuel couldn't shake the unease that crept in every time he thought about the life that was taking shape inside her. He wasn't prepared for what would happen when the child finally arrived. The day the baby was born, Samuel's world would be turned upside down. For he would soon discover that no amount of money could shield him from the shock that awaited. What happened next would leave him stunned, an emotional revelation that no one could have foreseen. Samuel Harrington had built his empire from the ground up, using his sharp mind and an unyielding will. But in matters of the heart, he was a stranger to vulnerability. His decision to ask Claire to bear his child had been made without a second thought. To him, it was a simple transaction, one that could secure his legacy in a way money never could. He was a man who had always prided himself on control, and this offer was no different. Claire had nothing to say about the terms, just a monetary promise that would change her life forever. As much as he wanted to believe that this was just a business deal, part of him wrestled with the idea. He had never stopped to consider the emotions of the woman he was asking to carry his child. Claire, a woman with few options in a life that had been far from easy, found herself caught in this strange web of power and money. She had grown up with little, struggling to make ends meet. The opportunity to escape her financial woes, to give her family a better life, was one that she couldn't ignore. But as the months went by, the complexity of the arrangement became harder to deny. Samuel watched as Claire's belly grew round, each day reminding him that this wasn't just a business transaction, it was real. The life inside her was a part of him, whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not. Their relationship had always been distant. Samuel kept his distance, as he always did with people, believing that closeness only led to weakness. Claire, too, kept to herself. They had a professional rapport, but beyond that, there was nothing personal between them. However, as Claire's pregnancy progressed, Samuel began to see her in a different light, not as a mere employee but as the woman who would carry his bloodline forward. Still, he never allowed himself to get too close. To him, Claire was a means to an end. The child she carried would cement his place in the world, ensure his name was remembered long after he was gone. That was all that mattered. But Claire, despite the financial security the deal promised, had begun to feel differently. At first, she had seen this as an opportunity, nothing more, nothing less. But as she grew accustomed to the idea of motherhood, her emotions became more complicated. She had spent years imagining a different life, one filled with love and warmth. But now, she was carrying a child who was nothing more than a pawn in Samuel's grand scheme. She began to question everything: the deal they had made, the life she had agreed to, and whether this child was truly a blessing or a burden. Could she go through with it? Could she give birth to a child under these conditions? She wasn't sure. Samuel had no such doubts. To him, everything was a calculated risk, a step toward securing his future. He thought of the child as an heir to his legacy, nothing more. His mind was consumed with the future, with ensuring that this child would carry his name with pride. It was the only thing that mattered. His wealth and influence could provide the child with everything, but the love and emotional bond were something he never anticipated needing. The pregnancy dragged on, month after month, and still, Samuel remained detached. He avoided any personal interaction with Claire, focusing only on the child's future. In his mind, he was already envisioning how he would introduce the child to his world, an heir to his fortune and his name. But deep inside, a nagging feeling grew, one he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, but something like regret, something he couldn't put into words. And then, there were the nights when he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering about the child he would soon meet. Would it be a boy or a girl? Would it be like him, inheriting his sharp features and quick wit, or would it be a reminder of the vulnerability he had tried to avoid for so long? The questions haunted him, and he tried to push them away. But there was no escaping them. No matter how much he tried to focus on his business, Samuel couldn't silence the unsettling thoughts about the child that would soon enter his world. He didn't know it yet, but the moment of truth was drawing near. It was a few weeks before the due date when Samuel finally allowed himself to think about the birth. He was anxious, nervous even, but refused to admit it to anyone, least of all Claire. He focused on the business, as he always did, telling himself that his empire was the only thing that mattered. The child, after all, was just the final piece of his grand plan. But deep down, Samuel knew that once the baby was born, his life would never be the same. The questions, the fears, the unknowns, they would all come to a head. And when the time came, he would have to face whatever it was that awaited him. The decision had been made. But the consequences? They were still to be revealed. The pregnancy had not been easy for Claire. As the months passed, she could feel the weight of her decision settling deeper within her. At first, the physical changes seemed like a distant inconvenience, but as her body transformed, so did her sense of identity. She no longer felt like the woman she once was. In the early stages, Samuel had barely acknowledged her growing belly. He maintained his distance, focused on his empire, and avoided any personal conversations. Claire, however, could feel his presence, his cold eyes occasionally glancing her way as she went about her work. He treated her like a servant, not a woman with a life inside her, and it left her feeling empty. Yet, as the pregnancy progressed, Claire began to feel an emotional attachment to the child she carried. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This was a business transaction, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, her heart had become involved. She had already imagined the child's tiny hands, the first time it would cry, the way it might look at her. It was a mother's instinct, even if it didn't seem to make sense in the context of the deal they had struck. Samuel, on the other hand, seemed as disconnected as ever. He would occasionally ask about her health, but his tone was clinical, almost dismissive. It was as if the pregnancy were just another task to check off his list, something to ensure the future of his legacy. He had no time for the complexities of motherhood or the emotional turmoil Claire was facing. The weeks were a blur for Claire. There were good days and bad days, but they all seemed to blend together. She spent most of her time alone, staring at the baby clothes she had bought in secret. It felt surreal to imagine herself holding the baby, knowing that it would never be hers to keep. She had agreed to this arrangement to change her life, but she hadn't anticipated the emotional toll it would take. Some nights, she would sit on the edge of her bed, rubbing her swollen belly, wondering if it was too late to back out. Could she change her mind? Could she keep the baby and leave Samuel behind? But each time, she reminded herself that this was her only chance for a better life. She couldn't afford to make an emotional decision. This child would give her a future she could never have imagined without Samuel's offer. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about escaping her old life. It was about the bond she was forming with the child inside her. Claire found herself wrestling with feelings of guilt and sadness, guilt for agreeing to this deal in the first place and sadness that the child would never have the chance to grow up in a world full of love, only to be used as a pawn in Samuel's grand plan. The deeper she fell into these emotions, the harder it became to keep her distance from Samuel. She could no longer ignore the growing tension in the house. It wasn't just the pregnancy that was weighing on her, it was the presence of Samuel, who hovered in the background like a ghost, offering no comfort, no understanding. There was a night, late in her third trimester, when Samuel approached her while she was sitting in the kitchen, cradling her stomach. He had never been so close before, and the sudden proximity made Claire's heart race. She looked up at him, expecting the usual cold indifference. But instead, she saw something else, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low. Claire was taken aback by the question. Samuel had never been this attentive, never shown any sign of care. She didn't know how to respond. She had always been the one to remain composed, but in that moment, she felt vulnerable. "I'm fine," she answered quickly, turning her gaze to the window. She didn't want to talk about her emotions, not with him. Not after everything that had happened. But Samuel lingered, his eyes still on her. "I know this wasn't what either of us expected," he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. "But it's important. This child, this is my legacy." The words were cold, clinical, but Claire could hear the strain in his voice. There was something more to his statement, something he wasn't saying. The truth was, Samuel wasn't just focused on his empire anymore. As much as he tried to convince himself otherwise, he was starting to understand the gravity of what was happening. This child, this baby, was no longer just a tool for his future. It was a life, a person, someone who would forever tie him to Claire, to this strange arrangement. But he didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how to face the reality of fatherhood. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Claire asked, her voice soft. Samuel hesitated, then nodded, though the doubt in his eyes told a different story. "It's what I've wanted. What I've needed. Everything will change when the baby is born, Claire. Everything will finally make sense." But Claire wasn't convinced. She saw through the mask he wore. His desire for control, for legacy, had clouded his judgment, and she realized then that Samuel's world would never be the same, not because of the baby, but because he couldn't understand the truth that came with parenthood. As her due date neared, Claire found herself more uncertain than ever about the future. She knew that once the baby arrived, nothing would ever be the same. And as much as Samuel tried to convince her that everything was going according to plan, she couldn't shake the feeling that something far more complicated was brewing beneath the surface. The day had finally come. Claire's due date was drawing near, and despite the mounting tension in the house, she couldn't escape the weight of the moment. Every part of her ached, physically and emotionally, as she prepared for what would soon be the most pivotal moment of her life. The child she had carried for so long was about to be born, and though she tried to keep her distance from the emotional complexity of the situation, there was no avoiding it now. Samuel had, as expected, remained largely detached from the process. He was busy with work, preoccupied with the image of the future he had carefully curated. The birth was just another step in his grand plan, a plan that, he believed, would secure his legacy. The idea that this child could be anything more than a tool had never crossed his mind. Yet, the closer the birth came, the more unsettled he felt. As Claire lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by sterile white walls, the intensity of the situation hit her with full force. She was alone in the room, save for the medical staff, her mind spinning with conflicting emotions. She hadn't seen Samuel since early that morning. He had promised to be there, of course, but deep down, Claire had no idea what that would even look like. What did it mean for him to be there? Was he present for the birth of his child, or was he just there to oversee another business transaction? The first wave of contractions hit Claire with such force that she gasped, clutching the sides of the bed. Pain surged through her body as she tried to steady herself. The reality of what she was doing, what she had agreed to, was hitting her hard. She was giving birth to a child she would never get to raise, a child who would never know the love and security that should come from being born into a family. The hours passed slowly, with Claire struggling through the contractions, each one more intense than the last. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the emotional toll that weighed on her heart. She could feel the child inside her, its tiny heartbeat echoing through her chest, and in that moment, she realized that no amount of money or power could make up for the deep emotional connection she had with this baby. It was when Samuel finally walked into the room, his suit still sharp and crisp, that Claire's anxiety peaked. He was here, finally, but there was something off about him. He looked out of place in the sterile environment, his presence almost suffocating. He stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped in front of him, as if trying to maintain control over a situation that had already spiraled beyond his grasp. "I'm here," he said, his voice distant, as though his words were meant to assure her more than himself. Claire could barely look at him. She nodded, not sure if she was relieved to have him there or frustrated by his cold detachment. The hours dragged on. Samuel had taken a seat by the window, his eyes glued to his phone. The weight of the silence between them was unbearable. He was physically there, but emotionally? He might as well have been a million miles away. Claire could feel it, the complete lack of connection between them. As the pain intensified, Claire felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring her to this exact point, to a place where she was about to give birth to a child that would not be hers to keep, a child whose life would be forever tied to Samuel's empire. Finally, with one final push, the baby was born. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the cries of the newborn filled the room. It was a sound she would never forget, the first cry of a child that she had given everything for, but would never truly be hers. The nurse wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and handed it to Claire. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. But as Samuel approached the bed, the air in the room shifted. He looked down at the baby in Claire's arms, his face unreadable. She held the child tight, her heart racing, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Samuel reached out slowly, his fingers trembling as he took a look at the baby. It wasn't the excitement Claire had hoped for. It wasn't even relief. It was something else. Is it a boy or a girl?" Samuel asked, his voice oddly strained. "A boy," Claire whispered, her own voice cracking with emotion. She couldn't stop the tears that flowed as she looked at the tiny face in her arms. It wasn't just the exhaustion of the labor or the weight of the moment, it was the overwhelming love she felt for this child. Despite everything, this baby was hers now, and nothing could take that away. But Samuel didn't share in her moment of awe. He looked at the baby with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something Claire couldn't quite identify. It was as if he was searching for something, waiting for a sign that the child would fulfill the expectations he had set for it. The silence in the room stretched out, filled only with the soft sound of the baby's cries. Samuel's eyes flickered between Claire and the child, his face still unreadable. It was clear that he hadn't anticipated what this moment would feel like. The nurse handed the baby to Samuel, but when he held the child, his hands seemed stiff and unsure. The great Samuel Harrington, a man who had built an empire with his bare hands, was suddenly unsteady in the face of something so raw and unmanageable. Claire watched it all unfold, unable to tear her eyes away. The reality was sinking in. No matter what Samuel had expected, the birth of this child wasn't just a business transaction. It wasn't about power, control, or legacy. It was about the miracle of life, a miracle that neither of them could fully comprehend. As Samuel held the baby in his arms, something deep within him shifted. For a man who had prided himself on control, the sudden weight of the child felt unnerving. It wasn't fear, but a deep unease, a realization that he couldn't deny anymore. The child in his arms wasn't just a tool to cement his legacy, nor a simple heir to his fortune. This was a real, living being. And somehow, in the chaos of his ambition, he had lost sight of that. Claire, watching from the bed, noticed the change in his demeanor. He looked at the baby with a perplexed expression, as if the child didn't fit into the neat little box he had imagined. Samuel had spent so much time planning his future around this moment, planning for this baby to be exactly what he wanted it to be. A perfect reflection of his success. But now, as he stood there holding the tiny, fragile life, the harsh reality of parenthood settled on his shoulders like a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. Claire could sense the tension in the room, the air thick with unsaid words. The baby, still crying softly, was oblivious to the emotions swirling around it. But to Claire, the moment felt pivotal. She knew that whatever Samuel had expected from this arrangement, it wasn't going to go the way he had planned. The child wasn't just his legacy, it was a reminder of everything Samuel had been avoiding, of the raw vulnerability and unpredictability of life that no amount of money could control. The nurse stepped back, allowing Samuel a moment to adjust to the baby in his arms. But Samuel, still standing stiffly, looked at Claire. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now held a flicker of confusion, something unfamiliar. "He doesn't look like me," Samuel muttered, almost to himself. Claire's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. But as the words hung in the air, she realized they were more than just an observation. They were a question that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Samuel blinked, his face turning pale as his eyes locked onto the baby's face. He seemed almost unnerved by the child's appearance, as if something about it didn't sit right with him. He stepped closer, examining the baby's features more closely. "It doesn't make sense," Samuel murmured, shaking his head. "He should look more like me." But, his eyes. His face. The word struck Claire like a blow to the stomach. She had known from the beginning that the pregnancy was an arrangement, not driven by love. But never had she considered the possibility that there was more to this than Samuel's simple wish for a child. Her mind raced, confusion and fear setting in. Could Samuel be suggesting something more? Something that threatened to unravel everything they had built, or thought they had built? "I don't understand," Claire said softly, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. "What are you saying?" Samuel paused, staring at the child as if it were some kind of puzzle that needed to be solved. Then, with sudden clarity, he spoke again, his voice low and sharp. "There's something off about this. I'm certain of it. His features don't match mine, he doesn't look like me at all." Claire's stomach churned. A deep, unsettling feeling grew within her as she realized what Samuel was implying. She had been the one carrying the child, but it wasn't just the biological bond between mother and child that mattered. It was the way Samuel was questioning the child's very identity. If the baby didn't look like him, then, what was the truth? With trembling hands, Claire reached for the baby. She needed to hold him, to reassure herself that this was real. As she cradled him in her arms, she noticed something she hadn't fully seen before. The baby's eyes, those bright, deep eyes, were not Samuel's. They were something else entirely. She couldn't put her finger on it, but they weren't his. A rush of dread hit Claire. Had Samuel been right all along? Was the child really his? And if not, what did that mean? What kind of tangled mess had they found themselves in? Claire's mind raced back to the months leading up to the birth. There had been no doubts, no questions about the arrangement. Samuel had promised that everything would go smoothly, that the child would be his, and his legacy would be ensured. But now, in this moment, everything felt like a lie. Samuel took a step back, his face drained of color. He was visibly shaken, struggling to make sense of what was happening. His usual composure, his unshakable confidence, had been replaced by a look of confusion and disbelief. "I don't understand," Samuel whispered again, almost to himself. "This isn't possible. This shouldn't be happening." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Claire's heart raced as she tried to comprehend the full extent of what had just been revealed. The child, a child Samuel had believed was his legacy, wasn't his after all. And now, Claire had to face the reality of what that meant. The past 9 months, the deal they had struck, the future they had both envisioned, it was all unraveling in front of her eyes. "Who is he really?" Samuel finally asked, his voice cracked, his gaze locked on the child. The question hung in the air, a sharp, painful reminder that everything was about to change. Claire had no answers. The truth was, she was just as lost as Samuel. The secrets of the child's origins, whether they lay in some twist of fate, a mistake, or something far more sinister, remained hidden. But one thing was certain, this was no longer just about a child born out of a business arrangement. It was about identity, bloodlines, and the shocking reality that nothing in life could be controlled. And now, both Samuel and Claire would have to face the consequences of their choices. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, suffocating the room as Samuel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the child in Claire's arms. Claire, holding the baby tightly to her chest, felt the cold rush of uncertainty flood through her. She had never imagined things would come to this, a truth so deeply unsettling, it threatened to rip apart everything they had built. Samuel's mind raced as he processed what had just unfolded. For a man used to having everything in his control, the feeling of helplessness was foreign and terrifying. He had always believed that he could shape his world to his will, that nothing could defy his intentions. But now, standing in that sterile hospital room, he realized that he had miscalculated. This child, this baby, was not his, and everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was suddenly in jeopardy. Claire's hands trembled as she cradled the child. She couldn't shake the feeling that her world had just shifted. She had spent the past 9 months convincing herself that this was just a business transaction, that the emotions didn't matter. But now, it was impossible to ignore the truth, this child wasn't just a means to an end. This was a real human being, with a future that would be far beyond anyone's control. "What do we do now?" Samuel finally asked, his voice strained. He had always been the one with the answers, the one who could dictate the course of events. But now, he was asking for guidance. He was lost. Claire met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. She had no answers. The truth was, she was just as lost as he was. How could she have trusted this arrangement? How could she have believed that money and power could shape a life so fundamentally? "I don't know," she whispered, the words thick in her throat. "I don't know what we're supposed to do." Samuel's face tightened with frustration, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a step toward Claire, but stopped short, as if unsure how to approach her. The distance between them felt larger now, more insurmountable than ever. What had once been a cold, calculated business deal had turned into something far more complicated, something neither of them had anticipated. The silence between them stretched on, filled with the sound of the baby's quiet, rhythmic breathing. The tiny life in Claire's arms seemed oblivious to the turmoil swirling around it, but to Claire, the child was a symbol of everything they had failed to control. It was a reminder that some things could not be manipulated, some things could not be shaped by money or power. Samuel's voice broke the silence again, but this time, it was quieter, almost fragile. I never meant for this to happen. Claire turned to look at him, and for the first time since the pregnancy began, she saw a glimmer of something real in his eyes. There was no arrogance, no sense of entitlement. Only regret. And for a moment, Claire wondered if he had truly understood the weight of what he had asked her to do. Had he understood the emotional cost of carrying his child? I never meant for it to go this far, Samuel continued, his gaze dropping to the child once more. I thought it would be simple. That I could just, he broke off, his words faltering as he struggled to make sense of his own thoughts. Claire felt a flicker of something inside her, a shift in her perspective. She had seen Samuel as a man of power, someone who used others to get what he wanted, someone who could manipulate any situation. But now, she saw him as something different, a man who had lost control, a man who was suddenly facing a reality that he hadn't planned for. And in that moment, she realized that Samuel's arrogance had always been a shield, a defense against a world that he couldn't fully control. But she wasn't sure if that realization changed anything. His regret didn't erase the damage that had been done, nor could it change the fact that their lives were now entwined in ways neither of them had anticipated. For Claire, the weight of the situation was too much to bear. She had agreed to this arrangement out of necessity, out of a desperate desire to change her life. But in doing so, she had created a situation where she would never be able to escape the consequences. This child, this innocent child, was the result of a decision that had been made out of greed, manipulation, and power. And no matter how much Samuel regretted it now, there was no undoing what had been done. As the baby stirred in her arms, Claire's heart broke for him. What kind of life would he have? What kind of legacy would he inherit, knowing that he had been brought into this world through an arrangement built on control and manipulation? Samuel took a step back, running a hand through his hair, the frustration and confusion on his face evident. What do we tell people? He asked, almost to himself. How do we explain this? Claire looked at him, her expression cold but determined. We tell the truth, she said, her voice steady. We tell them everything. This isn't just about your legacy, Samuel. This is about a life that's already here. We can't pretend it doesn't matter. Samuel stared at her, his brow furrowing. You think the truth will fix this? Claire's eyes softened. No. But it's the only thing we can do now. We can't control what happens next. All we can do is take responsibility for the choices we made. Samuel's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed to understand. He nodded, slowly, as if accepting the weight of what lay ahead. I never thought it would come to this, he said, his voice low, almost regretful. Neither of them had ever imagined how it would unfold. But now, in the quiet aftermath of the revelation, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. Days passed after the baby's birth, but the tension in the house had not dissipated. The shock of the revelation that had torn through Samuel and Claire still lingered, hanging in the air like a dense fog that neither could escape. There was no easy way to undo what had been done, no way to return to the lives they had once known. They were both trapped in the consequences of their decisions, bound together by a child that neither of them had anticipated. As Samuel sat in his office, the weight of responsibility bearing down on him, his thoughts kept returning to the same question: what now? His empire, built on precision and control, seemed irrelevant in the face of the reality he now had to confront. The child he had so carefully planned for wasn't his. The legacy he had envisioned, the future he had promised to secure, was shattered. And yet, as he stared at the photograph of the baby that sat on his desk, something inside him began to shift. He had spent his entire life building walls around his heart, convinced that control was the key to everything. But now, with a child that didn't belong to him in the traditional sense, he was beginning to see that control was an illusion. No amount of wealth or power could have prepared him for the overwhelming unpredictability of life. Samuel had once prided himself on being invulnerable, a man who could bend the world to his will. But in the presence of this child, and in the presence of Claire, he was learning something more profound. Life wasn't about control, it was about connection, about understanding the forces that bound people together, even in the most unexpected of circumstances. Claire, too, had been forced to reckon with the choices she had made. As the baby slept soundly in her arms, she watched the quiet rise and fall of his chest, and a sense of peace washed over her. It wasn't the peace she had imagined, not the one she had expected when she first agreed to Samuel's offer. But it was a peace of a different kind, one that came from accepting the truth, from understanding that some things in life couldn't be controlled, no matter how much effort was put into them. The child, a symbol of their mistakes, had become a bridge between them. Claire had never expected that the bond between mother and child could be so profound. She had come into this situation thinking only of herself, of the opportunity to change her life. But now, she saw things differently. This child was not just a means to an end. He was a person. He deserved love, care, and the kind of future that was far more important than any financial legacy. In the days that followed, Claire made a decision. She couldn't stay in Samuel's world, not in the way she had envisioned. There would be no pretending, no more games. She was the mother of this child, and it was time to step into the truth of what that meant. She approached Samuel with a newfound clarity. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady. "I've made my choices, and I've lived with them. But I can't keep living in a world where everything is dictated by control and power. This child deserves more." Samuel looked at her, and for the first time in months, he saw the woman who had agreed to carry his child, not just as a pawn in his grand design, but as someone with her own dreams, her own hopes. He didn't respond right away. The idea of losing Claire, of losing the one person who had been tied to his legacy in such an intimate way, was a difficult pill to swallow. But even he knew that it was the right thing to do. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "This isn't my world to control. I've lost sight of what truly matters." Claire nodded, feeling the weight of her own decisions lift. She had fought for so long to change her life, to escape the constraints that had defined her. But now, she realized that the most important thing she could do was to give this child a chance at a life where love and truth mattered more than power and wealth. The two of them, once so distant, now shared a moment of understanding. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic change in their relationship. But there was a recognition, one that transcended the mistakes of the past and looked toward a future where they could both find their way forward, in their own time and in their own way. As Claire left the mansion, walking out into the world with the baby in her arms, Samuel watched her go. He knew, deep down, that it was the right choice. It was the first step in a journey he had never anticipated. It was a journey toward understanding what truly mattered, a journey away from the illusion of control and toward the vulnerability that comes with being human. In the days that followed, Samuel found himself making changes, small at first, but real. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he was open to the possibility that it might not be the future he had planned. It might be something more, something better. And as Claire raised the child in a small, quiet home far from Samuel's empire, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But it would be hers to walk, with love and truth guiding the way. Life lesson. Sometimes, the choices we make lead us down unexpected paths, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. It's easy to think that control and power can shape our lives, but in the end, it's our connections to others, the love we give, and the truth we embrace that define who we truly are. Only when we let go of our need for control can we begin to live the life we were meant to lead.